Few words spark more intrigue in the Zelda community than Ura Zelda. Some are satisfied to think it is simply Ocarina of Time's Master Quest. Some whisper it morphed into Majora's Mask. Others are convinced, thanks to old interviews, lost footage, and Ocarina of Time's own source code, that the actual version is still locked up tight deep within Nintendo's vaults. Whatever theory you subscribe to, it's clear Ura Zelda was meant to function as Ocarina of Time's version of the original Legend of Zelda's second quest. But thanks to a botched accessory, troubled development, and the inevitable arrival of Nintendo's next system, that vision never materialized. So let's retrace the history, examine the evidence, subscribe to the channel, and discuss the mystery of Ocarina of Time's second quest, better known as Ura Zelda. First of all, what exactly is the second quest? As famously detailed elsewhere, and long before the ubiquity of New Game Plus, there was the Legend of Zelda Second Quest, a completely revamped version of the original, unlocked after completing the base game that was born out of a design mistake. With twice as much available memory, the developers were able to include a second version of the game with some heart containers, shops, and dungeons in different locations, completely new dungeon layouts, and increased difficulty, specifically meant to test veteran players who had conquered the base game or the unfortunates who named their file poorly. Zelda 2 also had a second quest, a significant downgrade, as Link carried over all his spells and levels, effectively making a second playthrough easier. Over time, as the base games became more complicated, second quests, now also known as Hero Mode or Master Mode, strayed further from the original's second quest. Though still unlocked after completing the base game or installing DLC, these modes equated to little more than cosmetic changes and increased enemy difficulty and variety. Skyward Sword almost got there, as a second quest from Zelda's perspective was pitched but scrapped. What remains of this idea can be seen in the game's end credit cutscenes. By all accounts, Ura Zelda was the only real attempt made to recreate the essence of the original Legend of Zelda's second quest. The history of Ura Zelda, roughly translated from Japanese as Other Zelda or Another Zelda, begins before the Nintendo 64's release and is intricately connected to a now infamous accessory. In 1995, a tech demo showcasing the graphical capabilities of the recently renamed Nintendo 64, previously called Project Reality and Ultra 64, began to ignite the imaginations of Zelda fans, as a brief clip of 3D Link fighting a knight was shown at Shoshinkai 1995, Nintendo's then annual video game trade show, perhaps more familiarly known as Space World. Also announced at this event was the 64DD, a peripheral item which stood for 64 dynamic drive or disk drive, the 64 a reference to the amount of megabyte storage it contained. The following year at Shoshinkai 1996, the 64DD prototype was revealed, with its expected release in 1997. The 64DD, which attached directly to the N64 console, was designed to allow developers freedom to store unprecedented amounts of gaming data on a console machine, in the form of room for code and data, the ability to save extensive amounts of custom data or stats, while sporting speeds faster than a disk, as well as having a real-time in-world clock and internet access, among a host of other capabilities. By using what basically amounted to thicker 3.5-inch floppy disks, the 64DD would drastically enhance the overall gameplay experience with better graphics and bigger games. It would also function in conjunction with a game cartridge to create future expansions for cartridge-based games, basically an early form of DLC. Though the 64DD displayed at the event was not operational, a demo on the system was shown, Zelda 64, the game that would eventually become Ocarina of Time, and which was originally developed specifically for the 64DD. The early vision of Zelda 64 was to create a persistent world. Every change Link would make to his surroundings would stick. If you smashed a box, it would stay broken. If you dug a hole, it would remain there until you covered it. If you left footsteps in the sand, they would stay. All this was supposed to be made possible by the enhanced storage space of the 64DD. As such, Zelda 64 was seen as not only a flagship game to sell N64 consoles, but also the 64DD add-on. In early March of 1997, because of limitations with the 64DD and perhaps additionally, troubles brewing behind closed doors, it was announced that Zelda 64 would have a complete and finished cartridge-based version, followed by a 64DD version afterward. The announcement also included additional information on the 64DD version. A future disc-based version of Zelda is said to appear on 64DD with more backup capabilities working simultaneously with the cart. Though it's not been confirmed whether this version will be a continuation of the cart game or a whole new adventure, it's speculated that it'll be a highly textured, more enhanced extension of the cart game. By May, the 64DD was delayed to the following year, and Zelda 64, meant to release around the holidays in 1997, was also delayed a year. As an aside, funnily enough, around this time, there was speculation that because Zelda 64 was confirmed as Nintendo's largest cartridge game ever at 32 megabytes, that Nintendo would sell it for an $80 or even $100 price point. For reference, the Switch's largest first-party game was Tears of the Kingdom at 18.2 gigabytes, almost 570 times larger. Ocarina of Time sold in the US for $59.99, while Tears of the Kingdom was notoriously sold for $69.99. In November 1997, at Nintendo's showcase, now officially called Space World, Miyamoto commented on the 64DD version of Zelda. Once we finish one Zelda game, it takes us 2, 3, or even 4 years to make the next one. To keep things going in the meantime, we can easily release something like a second quest version on the 64DD. For example, for a cartridge Zelda, we could make a Zelda that has some separate sort of feature that works with the cartridge and the 64DD. At the very least, don't expect something like the sequel to Zelda 64 to come out on the 64DD immediately. More like an expansion kit so that you can enjoy playing Zelda for even longer. So like you said, not a full Zelda 2 on the DD, more like Zelda 1.5. By 1998, not only was that year's Space World event canceled because of a lack of 64DD games, but Nintendo's own faith in the 64DD was shattered when it became clear that consumer interest in the Nintendo 64 remained low, and third parties who had left Nintendo by the wayside in favor of designing larger games more cheaply on PlayStation discs were skeptical that an add-on could succeed. Meanwhile, in May of 1998, Nintendo held a special session for the press regarding the soon-to-be-released Ocarina of Time, where Miyamoto and Tezuka gave a presentation and held a Q&A session, and Miyamoto made clear that a curiously named Zelda title for the 64DD was still being developed. Will there be a 64DD Zelda or an add-on? I don't know if add-on is the right terminology. For the 64DD, we are working on a Zelda game, which we call Ura Zelda, where you first play the initial disc version of Zelda. After finishing everything, you can enter into the world, into the basic design of the same. This sort of Ura Zelda is now in the works for the 64DD. Though the translation makes it difficult to conceptualize exactly what Ura Zelda would be, in late November, just a few days before the release of Ocarina of Time, Miyamoto spoke again about Ura Zelda for the 64DD, clarifying some details. Ocarina of Time has been designed with the disk drive system in mind, Mr. Miyamoto told IGN 64. More specifically, if you connect Zelda with the disk drive, an icon will appear on screen, announcing Ura Zelda or Another Zelda. There were several ideas that I could not incorporate into the current game because of the time shortage and other reasons. In the future, I want some new areas and new dungeons to be available for players who have already finished Ocarina of Time, where they will find new challenges. We were assuming that the disk drive system would be introduced next year, but since the DD hasn't been introduced, we have to still determine product reliability and other factors, which may not allow us to release Ura Zelda next year. On the prospect that the 64DD won't come out, Miyamoto said, "If that happens and we cannot introduce this second game, we may have to have a special edition release in the future." While Ocarina of Time was released to critical acclaim, the 64DD was delayed again, set to release sometime in 1999. To further complicate the mystery surrounding Ura Zelda, Sometime near the release of Ocarina of Time, the Zelda development team began working on a new project codenamed Zelda Gaiden, which translates to side story, the birth of which was described by co-director Eiji Aonuma in 2015. Since we've already made The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, we had 3D models that we invested a lot of time in to build. This all started by Miyamoto-san asking whether we could make a game in 1 year if we repurposed the models. But we were already talking about trying to make Master Quest for Nintendo 64DD. At the time when Ocarina of Time came out, there was a plan in the works of releasing Master Quest for 64DD. Correct. We were told to repurpose the dungeons from Ocarina of Time and make a game out of it, and I was handed the baton to make that happen. However, when we made Ocarina of Time, we made those dungeons thinking they were the best we could make. That's when Miyamoto-san asked me to remake them, so I hesitantly obliged. But I couldn't really get into it. To Aonuma-san, you just made the ultimate dungeon, so you didn't want to ruin a perfect formula. Exactly. So I secretly started making new dungeons that weren't in Ocarina of Time. And that was much more fun to me, so I grew up the courage to ask Miyamoto-san whether I could make a new game. He replied by saying it's okay if I can make it in a year. To complicate matters even further, in May Nintendo announced their next home console, codenamed Dolphin, while reiterating that their focus clearly remains fixed on the N64, which they believed had many more years of profitable life. In August 1999, a week before that year's Space World, where a demo of Zelda Gaiden would appear, Miyamoto clarified that game's relationship to Ura Zelda. We wanted to make a new game that is based on the Zelda system. Also, in the light of games that require the memory expansion pack like Donkey Kong 64, we wanted to make a Zelda game that took advantage of the memory pack as well. That game is Zelda Gaiden. Therefore, this will not be a game where the locations of the dungeons are simply changed around. Miyamoto added that the 64DD Ura Zelda is moving along on its own, but did not offer any more details, with no plans to unveil the 64DD Zelda. The following week, while demos of Zelda Gaiden were being played at Space World 1999, the long-awaited news came. Later that fall, the reservation campaign for the 64DD would begin in time to meet the add-ons release in mid-December. Miyamoto also offered more insights on Ura Zelda at the event. Ura Zelda is based on the Ocarina of Time for 64DD. It has the same construction of gameplay. It's very much a parody game based on Ocarina of Time, but with new dungeons to explore. It even features the same storyline. Further speculation followed both Zelda titles shortly after the event, including the ability to use the Game Boy camera to create custom masks and implement them into Ura Zelda, though all mask-related gameplay likely ended up in Zelda Gaiden. Several months later, the 64DD peripheral was finally released in Japan, just before the turn of the millennium on December 15, 1999. In partnership with Japanese media company Recruit, Nintendo established RANNet, a mail-order subscription service for 64DD and its additional hardware, which would drip-feed games monthly. With its long-delayed peripheral finally available, Nintendo crossed over into 2000, a year which would be fondly remembered, though not for the 64DD. In March, Zelda Gaiden was officially retitled The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Space World 2000 took place at the end of August, and announcements for the Game Boy Advance and GameCube, which, to showcase its abilities, included a Zelda demo, overshadowed a conspicuously absent 64DD, leaving IGN to report it as, unofficially, dead. Speaking around the same time, Miyamoto surprised many by stating Ura Zelda has been completed for some time now, with IGN continuing to describe it as an expansion to an existing game, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. The 64DD upgrade title offers new items, levels, and characters for those who already own Ocarina of Time. Forebodingly, the article ends. Miyamoto offered no specifics as to when Ura Zelda would come out for 64DD, or even if it would. While Majora's Mask was released to critical acclaim in late 2000, by February 2001, with the combined anticipation for the GameCube and the competition from the next-gen trio of the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, the 64DD was discontinued, having only sold 15,000 units and never seeing the light of day outside of Japan, solidifying it as a commercial failure. Speaking of commercial failures, the Nintendo GameCube was unveiled at Space World 2001 and launched toward the end of that year. A beta trailer for the Wind Waker was also shown, garnering tepid reviews. Ironically, though Ura Zelda was originally hitched to the 64DD hardware and Ocarina of Time software, with that time now long past, its release would now be tied to the GameCube and Wind Waker. By late 2002, in an effort to promote the forthcoming release of The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, it was reported that a special campaign disc that includes Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time from N64 and the previously deceased 64DD version of Ura Zelda, now called Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time GC Ura, would be available exclusively to those in Japan who pre-ordered The Wind Waker. In a December interview, Miyamoto was asked about the differences between this Ura Zelda for GameCube and the 64DD version. Although we did develop Ura for the 64DD, it didn't use many of the special features, so it was very easy to port over to the GameCube without cutting any features. Why we did it? Well, that was because the 64DD was only released in Japan, and it was only sold to subscribers of the RANNet system. For a long time, we wanted to make it available for play, and find a way to do that. It was expensive to make cartridges, so we had thought about different ways. One thing we thought about was tie-ins with magazines. Once GameCube moved to disc media though, it became much more feasible to make it available. In terms of how we've done it, we didn't want to make it limited edition, so we've tried to make it available to as many people as possible. Also, I'm not sure if you're aware, but Ura Zelda isn't very different from Ocarina of Time. It's more of a second quest. People who played through Ocarina of Time would be able to play through Ura Zelda and get a few laughs at some things, find some things more difficult, and take a few varied paths. However, even if you do play all the way through the end, it will not unlock anything special. It was also around this time that the bonus disc was confirmed for pre-orders in the US, with Ura Zelda dubbed Ocarina of Time Master Quest. Released alongside Wind Waker in the US in February 2003, Ura Zelda in the form of Master Quest was finally here. So, what did it amount to? As an IGN review of the bonus disc describes, Master Quest is not the same game as Legend of Zelda DD. Originally, the game that would eventually become Ocarina of Time was planned as a 64DD only game. The idea was to create a Zelda adventure that featured more persistent environments and more features that used the system's rewritable capabilities. As it became clear that the N64 wouldn't sell as well as expected in Japan, Nintendo redesigned Zelda DD for cartridge release. At the same time, it hatched plans for an add-on disc that would only be playable by owners of the cartridge adventure, Ocarina of Time. The idea for this second quest goes back to the very first Zelda game, Legend of Zelda for NES. After beating the game once, starting a new game with the name Zelda would send gamers out on a second quest. Which isn't exactly true. You can name your file Zelda at any point in the original and be sent to the second quest unbeknownst to you. The article continues, Master Quest is the same way. It's not a different game from Ocarina of Time per se, but it's sufficiently altered to enthrall gamers, even if they've just finished playing through the original quest. The overall adventure is unchanged in Master Quest. You still wake up in Kokiri Forest, you still get Epona the same way, you still face the same bosses, characters, and events. But the moment you step into a dungeon, all bets are off. Each dungeon has been redesigned to offer new challenges, and in turn, mess with returning players by remixing the puzzles and the room progression completely. While the actual dungeon layout and graphics remain the same, Master Quest often requires you to take completely different routes from the original. It assumes that you've finished the original quest and spends less time on teaching you the basics. On the flip side, some of the puzzles aren't as well constructed as the originals. Thus, the water temple is a bit easier to complete now than before, although some of the puzzles have the potential to stump you if you don't pay close attention and properly survey the rooms when you enter. And the progression through the dungeons isn't always as smooth as in the original. Thus, the standard Ocarina of Time quest is still the better choice for first-time players. But if you've already finished the game before, Master Quest becomes a very entertaining and much more difficult nut to crack for returning players. Not only was progression and navigation within each dungeon and mini-dungeon altered, even the Ice Cavern, Bottom of the Well, and Gerudo Training Ground are revamped, they are much more reliant on Bombchus, Din's Fire, the Song of Time, and in the spirit of the original second quest, hiding dungeon progression behind seemingly unintuitive or blatantly invisible mechanics. Blink and you'll miss it moments, tougher enemies, and in one particular dungeon, introducing cows as switches trapped in the tissue of a great fish. There is an added emphasis on returning to older dungeons more often to retrieve gold sculptulas, locked behind items or abilities unavailable to the player at the time. Though Master Quest does offer a new spin on a familiar world, for those looking for an added challenge within Ocarina of Time's world, it left some feeling, after all Ura Zelda was supposed to be, is that it? To be fair, what was quote-unquote left out of Master Quest and anticipated by fans can be attributed to its long, winding development and the seemingly contradictory statements about Ura Zelda by Miyamoto, resulting in a tale of 3 games. Let's sum up. Zelda 64, first shown in 1996, was an ambitious title built completely around the 64DD. In 1997, it would severely scrap many of its ideas once it downgraded from the 64DD to a cartridge, bifurcating into what we know as Ocarina of Time, released in 1998 on cartridge, and Zelda DD, or Ura Zelda, to be released later on the 64DD as an expansion to that cartridge. Meanwhile, the third game, Zelda Gaiden, which clearly iterated on old ideas from its predecessor and infused many new ideas, would eventually become Majora's Mask, released in 2000. Over this period, Miyamoto would refer to Ura Zelda as Zelda 1.5, another version of Zelda where all the dungeons will be replaced by new ones, having some new areas or new dungeons, a parody game based on Ocarina of Time but with new dungeons to explore, and a second quest with new maps and scenarios, different dungeons, and new locations for the treasures. Interestingly, in the IGN article where Miyamoto comments that Ura Zelda has been completed for some time, the addition of the 64DD upgrade title offers new items, levels, and characters for those who already own Ocarina of Time is not actually attributed as a quote from Miyamoto, nor is it clear that these details are from Miyamoto himself or rather speculation from IGN. Beyond that, Miyamoto's conception of Ura Zelda doesn't seem more than what ended up in Master Quest. This was again corroborated by Aonuma in a 2009 Iwata Asks interview. We'd already made 3D models for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. By changing the situation, couldn't we make new ways to play, a new story? So you made The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. No, we didn't just start making The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, not right away. There was actually a flip side, and in the beginning, the idea was to make a Ura flip side Zelda. That Ura Zelda, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Master Quest, was developed for the 64DD. Ultimately, we recorded it on a limited edition disc that went to people who reserved The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker. Ultimately, other staff handled The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Master Quest. Still, as someone who had been in charge of the dungeons, I couldn't get that excited over making a flip side for them. I couldn't see it turning into a new The Legend of Zelda either, but we'd been told to make The Legend of Zelda. It isn't as though we could just say, I don't want to, and end it there. At that point, Miyamoto-san gave us a trade-off. He said, if we could make a new The Legend of Zelda game in 1 year, then it wouldn't have to be a flip side. This is also corroborated by the actual Ocarina of Time code, which, though it does contain the hooks to connect whatever would be a 64DD version, and can be tricked into displaying the 64DD title screen, the 64DD connectivity was limited, replacing dungeons, dungeon maps, dungeon treasure chest icons, text and staff credits, and overall aligning closely with Master Quest. Fan speculation for additional quests and items in 64DD, like potentially being able to beat the Running Man, the Unicorn Room, and obtaining the literal Triforce, are all pulled from the early development of Zelda 64, as well as Zelda 64 beta questing, which refers to leftover data on the Ocarina of Time game cartridge, only accessible through GameShark or Debug ROM, which includes items like additional tunics, the Ocarina pedestal, and the now famous Arwing in Kokiri Forest. None of these additions were ever confirmed for Ura Zelda, and are largely the misconceptions of fans hoping for something more than what was ever intended, making Master Quest less of a rushed appeasement to fans and more Ura Zelda's original intent. even if it didn't amount to greater changes like the original Legend of Zelda Second Quest was able to offer, or more expansive moments. However, whether or not this is true is still hotly debated 25 years later. It seems, like most things, that the mystery of Ura Zelda is more intriguing than its answers. And while the development of Zelda 64 resulted in debatably two of the greatest games ever made in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, if you want to bemoan what could have been the greatest gaming experience in the history of mankind, Zelda 64, blame it on the 64 DD. If you'd like to review all the sources yourself, which I had a lot of fun doing while writing this video, the Google Doc with links to all those sources is in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.